Next, in the standard C function library, I want to have a look at input and output. Input and output to and from files. Now this is quite a lengthy topic. However, it's extremely important. To be able to read and write information to and from a file is just one of the most important things a C programmer can learn how to do. We don't learn any new things about the language here, but we do learn some very handy standard C library functions. So let's have a look at them. All these functions are to be found in stdio.h. At the moment we've only used stdio.h to do, well, a couple of things. We've done it for printf, scanf, getchar, fflush. Remember those? Now I know they don't sound like file-based input and output. They sound more like screen and keyboard-based input and output. But you'll find as this chapter progresses that they're one and the same thing. Because stdin, stdout, and stderr are three special files. Well, they're not really files, but we treat them as files. We think of stdin as a file that we can read from, and we think of stdout and stderr as files that we can write to. Stdin being, of course, the keyboard, stdout being the screen, and stderr, which is short for standard error, is actually also the screen. It's just another way that you can write to the screen. I'll learn more about that later. When you need to open a file for some kind of data input or output, now you obviously don't need to open standard input, standard output, or standard error. They're already open for you. But if you want to access a regular file off your hard disk or floppy disk or whatever, then you need to open it. All files must be opened first. You open a file, then you do some operation on it, like you write some data to it or you read some information from it, and then finally you close the file. That's the sequence that you do this all in. The sequence is the same no matter what type of file it is. It doesn't matter whether it's a big file or a small file, a hard disk or a floppy disk, whether you're reading from it, whether you're writing to it, it doesn't matter. You must open it, then read or write, and then close. Now, there are three ways that you can open the file, and they're specified here on the screen. You can open it for reading, you can open it for writing, or you can open it for appending. What does that mean? Well, think of Windows Notepad, a really simple text editor. And you want to open up a file, make some modifications to it, and save it, and then close Notepad. That's a pretty standard thing to want to do. What Windows Notepad will do is it will open the file twice. At the beginning of the session it will open it once for reading. It will open it, read all the information in that file into memory, and then you'll make some modifications to all that data in memory, and then when you're done, you'll issue a save command. You'll go file save, at which point Notepad will open up the same file a second time, and this time it will open up for writing, write all the information from memory back out to the file, and close it a second time. So you'll do two opens and two closes, and the first one you'll do an open and a read and a close, and the second time you'll do an open and then a write and then a close. Appending is simply adding to the end of an existing file. Now, I need to talk to you about types of files. Now, I'm not talking about Word documents versus Excel spreadsheets versus text documents versus MP3 files. I'm not talking about that type of file. I'm talking about two different types of files as far as C programming is concerned: text files and binary files. Text files are files that typically contain only printable characters. In other words, they're just like regular text files. You might have an extension of .txt, or you might have an extension of HTML, or you might have an extension of INI, an INI file. Any file that is readable by a human being just as naked raw text is considered to be a text file. And I'm not talking about Word documents. A Word document certainly contains text, but it contains a whole bunch of other stuff as well. Formatting information, control files, control characters, pictures, all sorts of stuff that's not just text. They fall into the other category of files, which is binary files. Binary files can typically contain any data at all. With a text file, you typically read data from the file on a line-by-line basis, and you write it out on a line-by-line basis. Binary files, you typically read data in and write data out in blocks of data. You might read it in 1 kilobyte blocks at a time, or write it out in 1 kilobyte blocks at a time. Or you might write it out one structure at a time. You'll see what I'm talking about when we actually do an example of that. So when you actually come to specify that you want to open a file, you actually need to tell the operating system which type of file you're treating this as. The operating system doesn't know. You have to write that as a coder. You have to say, well, this file, I want to open this up in text mode, or I want to open this up in binary mode. You specify that. The operating system does not know. It's vitally important to remember that. It might be obviously a text file, but you can still open it up in binary fashion, and vice versa. It's just recommended that you don't. So it's kind of up to you to keep track of this. Anyway, here are the functions that we use to read and write and open and close and all that sort of thing when we're talking about files. First of all, we use something called fopen and fclose. The F always stands for file. So file open and file close. Obviously, anything you open, you have to close, and you must open a file before you can do anything to it, including before you can close it. Once you've opened it, there's a lot of things you can do to it. Now look at this, you've got an fprintf and an fscanf. These are used with text files. They are exactly what they look like. They are a printf and a scanf that are used to write and read data to and from a text file, rather than to and from the screen/keyboard. We'll look at those later in a moment. We've got fputs and fgets. We've kind of already seen those. We've seen them where we specified that we wanted to write to standard output and we wanted to read from standard input, but now we'll find that we can read one line of text or write one line of text from a text file. And fputc and fgetc, you haven't seen those before, but they're just like getchar, except that instead of reading a character from the keyboard, you can read a character from the file. You can read the file a character at a time if you want to, and you can write out characters to the file one character at a time using fputc if you want to. So there's a few options at your disposal. All of those are for text files. With binary files, you use something called fread and fwrite. And we'll look at those properly a little bit later on. There's also something called fseek, which you can use to move around inside a file when you're, say, reading from it. You might like to read a bit of data from the beginning and then move to the end and read a bit of data from the end, and so on. That's what fseek is. So you seek around inside the file, just like you can imagine a head seeking around on a hard disk, seek for this file and then read it, seek to that file and then write it. Now, all of these functions, these are known as our standard I/O or buffered I/O functions, should not be confused with open, close, read and write, and seek. Those functions exist as well, and they're also used for files. So they're often confused with one another. Fopen is often confused for open, and fclose is often confused for close, and so on. But they are different. You must not confuse them. I'm not going to explain what the differences are here. If you're interested, you can go and read up in the documentation of the standard C library function and explain to yourself what the differences are. For the purposes of our discussion, we're going to be using fopen and fclose because they are the most commonly used functions. They're used probably 80% of the time. Open and close are certainly used and they have their uses, but fopen and fclose are used more frequently. Okay, in the next module, I'm going to go into these in a little bit more detail, find out some technical details about how to use them and what they're for and so on.